everyone, welcome to our panel, Flawed, Finance, and What Can We Do About It? We have a wonderful panel today to talk about a topic that might sound abstract, but that impacts the lives of people and communities around the world, flawed finance and the offshore system. We'll be talking about failures in the system and what can we do about it from different perspectives. And we have a very interesting panel. I'll briefly introduce everyone here. So we have on one side, Anthony Cormier. He's an investigative reporter for BuzzFeed News and is based in New York. And while working for the Tampa Bay Times, he won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. We also have Carina Carvalho in Portugal. She's a native from Angola, if I'm correct. And she is the top executive director of Transparency International in Portugal. And she's a sociologist with a postgraduate study in globalization studies. And while in Africa, she actually looked very closely at the cost of corruption and its impact in everyday life. And actually, that's something she looks closely still in her current job. So we'll be looking at her perspective too. And we also have Linda Liswell. She's also in New York, and she's the third superintendent of the New York State Department of Financial Services. And there, the Department of Financial Services in New York, they supervise activities of nearly 1,500 banking and other financial institutions and more than 1,800 insurance companies. So everyone has different experiences and expertise about the financial world. And we will be bringing all those expertise into our panel. And I'm Emilia Iostruck, I'm ICIJ's data and research editor. So let's travel a bit back in time. Let's go back to 2020. And that year at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, we published two major investigations related to the topic of flawed finance, corruption, money laundering, role of intermediaries, banks. And one of them, in September 2020, ICIJ, BuzzFeed News, and more than 100 media partners around the world published the FinCEN Files, which was a 16-month investigation that started with a trove of more than 2,100 suspicious activity reports that banks and other financial institutions filed with the US Department of Treasury's Financial Crime Enforcement Network, or known as FinCEN. And that investigation had many revelations on the system itself, some parts of how the system was failing, and revealed how banks continue to move dirty money even after they paid fines and promised to clean up their acts. We also reviewed there are some laws, regulations, but it seems that, there's still money tied to illicit money flows that is ongoing, flowing around the world. So Anthony Cormier was at the heart of this investigation and was there from the beginning. So he can tell us more details about how this investigation started, but also we would love to hear more about what did the team find while exploring these suspicious transactions flagged by the banks. We were talking about that the team explored more than $2 trillion in transactions. And then what were some of these systemic failures that were exposed and that the team identified that were tied to the anti-money laundering system and the reporting system?
Sure, thanks, Emmy. I think probably at the risk of getting too far in the weeds, it's important to explain what the SARs are, what this system is, right? Banks all over the world have compliance teams. And those are folks who are supposed to make sure that the bank is complying with the law. And compliance teams include not only on the ground sort of detectives, folks who are out there trying to determine who owns a company or what the money is being used for. These banks also employ very complicated algorithms to try to track and understand the money that's flowing into and out of its vaults. And so when these compliance teams suspect that there is unusual, potentially illicit behavior, they're required by US law to tell the US government. They file a document called a Suspicious Activity Report, or a SAR, to the Treasury Department. And the disclosure of these documents has been quite revelatory. You'll have to understand that very few of these documents have ever made their way into the public. And we at BuzzFeed News and our very good friends at ICIJ and our partners around the world were able to extract from them information that showed us the way the system is sort of broken. I think it's important to recognize that there are failures by the banks. The compliance teams often don't know who their customers are. The banks are sometimes disincentivized to stop suspicious transactions. Quite often, we find that they flag the company, they send them to the Treasury Department, but they don't close their accounts. They continue to accept their money. So there's this sort of perverse system whereby bonuses and profits are sometimes, they belong to illicit actors. I think at the Treasury Department, we found that in 2019 alone, they received 2 million of these reports. That number has doubled over the past decade, while the staff, the people who are supposed to be, perusing these documents, that staff has shrunk by 10%. And so insiders tell us that there's no way that every one of these reports is ever going to get read. And I think at the U.S. Justice Department, these documents act, unfortunately, like a get out of jail free card. It's as though the banks, as long as you file these documents, you are okay. It's when you don't file them that you sort of get that the banks get some scrutiny or get in some kind of trouble. So I think that the system is flawed in each individual component. The banks, the Treasury Department, who acts as a regulator, and the Justice Department, which is supposed to, sort of investigate these matters.
Thanks, Anthony. And talking about the system, we have someone here, Linda Liswell, who's very familiarized with supervising the activity of banks. And I understand in September 2020, after the FinCEN Files came out and we published the FinCEN Files, you wrote an opinion editorial titled, "We Must Hold Banks Accountable to Stop Money Laundering." And there you stated, over the decades, we have allowed the problem to metastasize so that it's endemic in the system and wrapped within the guts of financial institutions. How did we get there? Could you clarify who do you mean by we? Are you including government as well there? And could you tell us a bit more about the key systemic problems you have identified all these years, like looking at the activities of banks?
Yes, Emilia, thank you so much. This problem is immense and it's deeply problematic. As you said at the beginning, this is not a theoretical or esoteric matter that we're talking about. Criminal activity is about the money. That's why people commit white-collar crimes. It's about the money, follow the money, that's the expression. So the money, the trillions of dollars in dirty money washing through the global financial system, by the way, not just the United States, furthers criminal activity, in many cases constitutes criminal activity, drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, all kinds of abhorrent criminal activity that no corporate citizen wants to be involved in. And the question is, what are they doing about it? And what are we doing as a society about it? And yes, we are all responsible. If you think about it, the suspicious activity report, it's about 25 years old. It's 1996, it was updated after 9/11 to be more useful in terrorism matters and the like. But it's a little bit like putting our finger in the dike. As Anthony indicated, there are millions of these reports that are filed. And if any financial institution or individual believes they can just file the SAR and be done with it, it's not just a fig leaf, it's a bit of a hot potato. Here, it's your problem now. And it's not a system that is currently working. It can't be the only thing that we do. And I know that will be the dialogue across our panel discussion. But the government has known since before the suspicious activity report that money laundering is a vast problem. The integrity of our financial system has to be paramount. we talk about the rule of law. Some people think that's sort of uncool. The rule of law is what protects all of us, including against corruption and these horrendous crimes that affect real people, as you indicated. And government has to elevate the rule of law. We went through 4 years where that was not the case, right? The rule of law matters. Institutions matter. Government institutions matter. The independence and integrity of our law enforcement entities matter. Intergovernmental cooperation matters. The New York Department of Financial Services can have some impact, but not a heck of a lot by ourselves. Partnerships with the federal government, partnerships with the global financial regulators, right? Money laundering is a burgeoning problem in Europe. They're taking some measures to address it. But if we operate in silos, we are not going to be effective. And I will further say, and I'm a former federal prosecutor, so I know wherever I speak, the suspicious activity report is not really being effectively used. It is something that frequently law enforcement looks to after the fact, when they're already conducting an investigation. Let me see what SARs were filed and what do they say, and does that provide me with additional leads? We must get to a place of proactivity. That means government, that means financial institutions. We have to get ahead of it. The risk analysis has to be different. The incentives have to be different. We've got to digitize the data. The institutions that are filing it have to have confidence that it's being read and interpreted. And by the way, maybe we need to add a box that says, thank you for this SAR. Now, what did you actually do about it?
Well, thanks so much. What is done about it, and that allows me to connect nicely with our next question for Carina, is we have the suspicious activity reports, and part of the FinCEN Files, we also had one name of a person that we also investigated before early in 2020 as part of another investigation we did. It was the Luanda leaks. There we exposed inner workings of a global business empire of Isabel dos Santos, and how this global business empire was fueled by hundreds of millions of dollars in public money siphoned from the poorest, one of the poorest countries in the world, like which is Angola. And there, like the money flew, of course, through the financial system. We had some of those reports in the SARS, but we also looked at the roles of intermediaries, and both in Luanda leaks and FinCEN Files, we identified a significant use of offshore companies. So, which is like, well, who knows who is behind these companies? There is another level of secrecy that is added to the system. And we know, Carina, you have looked very closely into these topics. And in your role at Transparency International, Portugal, what are the key problems that you see that you have identified for this system? Like both in FinCEN Files and Luanda leaks, and that connection of like how the system is working at a global scale, and what has been done at different levels.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here with such strong panelists and team. Let me just clarify that Angola is not one of the poorest countries in the world. In fact, it's one of the most resource-rich countries in the world. It suffers from what the scholars call the paradox of plenty. So a country that has plenty of resources, but the people living there don't benefit from that wealth. So for me, and taking on what Anthony and Linda were saying, I think it's clear from well, pretty much since the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, but more clearly with Luanda leaks and now with FinCEN Files, there is a money laundering industry based on the global north, being the global north, the US and European countries. And it's an industry, and I think we need to look very careful for this fact. These are not small initiatives. It's a whole bunch of people working and getting a lot of money by facilitating illicit financial flows coming from underdeveloped countries, coming from kleptocratic regimes, coming from criminal activities, and from tax evasion, right? So this is an industry. And I think the first thing that we should look is to the role of enablers. We're talking about big consultancy firms. I would say the big four, but there are a lot of other consultancy firms involved. We can talk about lawyers, accountants, and mostly the banking sector. One thing that I can share with you all is what happened in Portugal related to the role of the Portuguese Central Bank. So the governor of the Portuguese Central Bank, after the Luanda Leaks scandal, he was in Parliament asking questions regarding what the Portuguese bank, the central bank, did to secure compliance from Eurobic, one of the banks owned by Isabel dos Santos. And what the governor said, well, we identified flaws in their compliance system, but it's not up to us to solve those flaws. Then we learned from reports from OCCRP that there were 2 audits made by the Portuguese Central Bank, the first one in 2015, and nothing happened since 2015 until 2020 when the Luanda Leaks scandal arrived. So, and if you read those reports from the investigators and the ones that were checking, you know, checks and balances in Eurobics, you will see that simply Eurobic didn't have a compliance system in place. It's clear. You just need to look. But regardless of that, they continue to operate and they continue to wash money coming from Isabel dos Santos and her shady deals into the Portuguese economy, not just into the Portuguese banking system, really to the Portuguese economy, and preventing people in Angola from benefiting from what the country is able to produce. So what you see here is, aside lack of regulation and lack of supervision, you also see lack of AML, anti-money laundering enforcement. We are a EU member state, so we needed to transpose key legislation at EU level, such as AMLD4 and the AMLD5, installing, for example, the creation of beneficial ownership registries, public, open, accessible to everyone to see who are the ultimate owners of, you know, companies, trust funds, and even real estate. And you will also see by AMLD5 the need to check political exposed persons. So if you look into the news from the last, I don't know, I think 4 years ago or 5 years ago, Isabel dos Santos and her husband, now he died sadly, but they were received in Portugal as businessmen and women, you know, and they were received by very important people here in the country, you know, mayors, politicians, ministers, and no one was considering the fact that she was in fact a politically exposed person. So she should be treated as such by AML enforcement. And I think also one thing that we should look into is the problem that we have now, especially on the Luanda Leaks case, which is asset recovery and victim compensation. It will be very hard for the Angolan population to recover the stolen money. Very hard. And this happens because we see that investigative authorities, they lack resources, you know, human, technical, technological, and financial resources, but also because these processes are too legalistic. You know, there is a huge battle on trial, and I think it will last many years until all the funds could be recovered by the Angolan population. And when we look at the situation where we are, the pandemic, you can imagine how those funds could be used in benefit for the Angolan population, because they don't have a proper health system. And indeed, they don't have money to buy the vaccines, nor the masks, nor not anything. So for me, these are the key problems, but pretty much how the global north acts as an enabler for the misery and the poor life conditions that people in the global south experience because of what we're doing here instead of working for better AML enforcement and to prevent illicit financial flows. So for now, I think these are the key elements that I should like to showcase.
Well, thanks very much, Carina. I think this connects very well because you were talking about delays in the reporting system, and at the same time, Linda was talking about reactive SARs, and SARs sometimes like also being filed late, and and how the SAR system and how, when law enforcement look at SARs. So it's all different pieces of the system. And the Luanda Leaks case, and I know you are an expert on Angola, like it's very telling too, because as you said, like you have a country, an old country, lots of resources, wealthy on one side, but on the other side, you have people living in very poor conditions. And then you have all these contradictions, roles of enablers. And this connects with our next question. I would like to start with you, Carina, as like you were already talking about this, is why should we care about this? Like, why should we care about money laundering? People talk about corruption, people talk about money flows, illicit money flows. It can sound abstract. How do these systemic failures everyone has been talking about here affect regular citizens? What's the social impact?
I think you will see obvious link between corruption and illicit financial flows and human rights and sustainable development. I think that's clear. And even if you look into SDG 16 from the UN Agenda 2030, you will see that corruption is there. Also because corruption and all these shady deals, they have a clear impact on human rights. And I think the situation regarding the Luanda Leaks case is pretty much obvious how that impact is showcased. But I can also give you two other examples, even the Portuguese example. We have been working on golden visas for the last, 5 to 6 years. So golden visas are permits to live in the country. People can live in Portugal if they purchase real estate of €500,000, for example. And you will see that AML compliance is completely off the program because the program is inscribed in our immigration policy. So it's the immigration setup that deals with golden visa. But we found out that, and not just us at Transparency International, but Global Witness and Tax Justice Network, you will see that the real estate sector is particularly vulnerable to money laundering and to work as a channel for illicit funds. If you see, for example, the situation in Lisbon related to golden visas, you will see there is a link between golden visas, so money laundering through real estate, with gentrification and housing problems. So the price of housing in Lisbon increased tremendously because of golden visas. So there's a concrete example of how AML, a lack of AML enforcement and illicit financial flows could have a clear impact in everyday lives. But for example, if you look into the situation in Mozambique with the scandal related to the secret debt, you will see that Mozambique now faces a very hard situation related to Daesh in Cabo Delgado, so terrorism. And that's also because of illicit financial flows, money laundering, and corruption. So that's why, for me, we need to inscribe money laundering and corruption as a human rights offense. We're not just talking about the impacts of money laundering and corruption in human rights, but also to start looking into corruption and money laundering as a human rights offense. Because I think this is the only way for us, mostly civil society organizations, to start acting in strategic litigation setups. Because we are always too dependent of the role of governments. Because the governments need to initiate, asset recovery processes. The governments need to interact with other governments in Europe, for example, requesting for the seizure of stolen assets. But I believe that people should have a say in all these processes. That's why, for example, I think it's very positive in the US to exist the Global Magnitsky Act. And the Global Magnitsky Act, for example, includes corruption as an offense. And I think that's very positive. I can elaborate a bit more on that, but I think we need a different setup, and people should join hands together with investigative journalists, of course, but also with people willing to speak up against corruption and against money laundering. That's why we also defend a lot the protection for whistleblowers here in Europe. And we're very glad that we have now a new directive for the protection of whistleblowers coming on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carina. And particularly talking about these cases of corruption cases and PEPs and terrorism and different actors that are involved in these illicit financial flows. As part of the FinCEN Files and like navigating those $2 trillion in suspicious transactions, like there were many cases that involved corruption scandals and like, people who were under investigation at some point and the alerts came later, plenty of politicians. And at the same time, like the team looked closely at the victims of the system. So, and that human impact, so how that's connected. So I would love for you to, Anthony, to tell us a bit more about some of the most emblematic cases that you remember from the FinCEN Files that expose that, like that connection with this illicit financial flows and victims. Like, who are the victims of the system?
Right, just as Linda and Carina both said, that you can look at this through a couple of lenses, right? Top down, you can see the robbing of the wealth of nations. You see transnational crime, narco sales, human trafficking, terror. But when you continue to dig and go to the bottom, you recognize that money laundering has an enormous impact on the most basic of human functions, right? We examined how a massive scandal at Deutsche Bank had bankrupted or left sort of impoverished a gym owner in Los Angeles, a dentist. You know, they wake up one morning, their payroll taxes are gone, and they have to lay off their employees, and they don't know where the money has gone. They don't know what to do. And it turns out it, has been reportedly stolen by an individual that has laundered it into the Russian, laundromat, one of the biggest scandals, global financial scandals of the last few years. And so you've got these people on the ground who are being hurt. You can look at the city of Cleveland, for instance, and you can show how an oligarch essentially has taken money out of his home country, deposited it into Cleveland. He essentially, as ICIJ story says, he ate the town of Cleveland. Left people without jobs. It's left the city at a deficit. And I think that again, on a human level, we saw a Ponzi scheme that essentially robbed poor immigrants of $80 million. Essentially, they gave an accused Ponzi schemer a whole bunch of money, and even after the bank knew or was told that, hey, this company's been deregulated, it's been decertified, it's under investigation by secretaries of state, it should not be doing business. What did the bank do? It continued to allow this individual to send or receive $15 million. I mean, it's writings on the wall for the bank. You know that there are people who are losing their shirts, and yet they continue to take this individual, this company's money. And I think that across the spectrum, we found both the big picture, the impoverished nations failing of healthcare, transnational crimes. We also saw that individuals are harmed and hurt in very real ways by systems that they don't understand and they don't seem to believe that they're connected to, but they in fact are.
Thanks, Anthony. And going back to the banks, like some of the actions that have been taken as well, fines. And I think Linda has also talked a bit about it and like in this editorial and has looked at it. But I would like to know, is it fair to say that major fines, hundreds of millions of dollars fined against banks, haven't done enough to suppress profit-making incentives to allow illicit funds to flow freely? What is your perspective of these fines? Is this just a case of doing business for the banks? Should the responsible individuals be held accountable in addition to fining the institutions? What do you think?
So fines can only go so far. We've got to get beyond fines. Banks are corporations, they're not charities, they're profit-making enterprises. And they make a risk analysis about their deal flow and who they're going to do business with and how they're going to respond to their compliance department. And it would be naive to think that they don't factor into that, even subconsciously, what is the impact if we get caught? And so long as what happens is the bank as this institution is hit with a fine and some bad press, it's not going to be enough. And a corporation is not just a corporation, right? It's a collection of people. It acts through people, through the board of directors, through the executive suite, and the senior and mid-level officers and the staff, including the compliance department. And it's all too easy for some critics to say, well, where is the compliance department? But so long as financial institutions that are profit-making enterprises view the compliance department as a cost center, where what they invest there is simply a cost and there's no return for them, we are not going to have the kind of rigor within these institutions that we need. Compliance departments are too often viewed as back office. They're not paid equally. They're not recruited equally. They're the first to be cut when times are tough, when it should be the reverse. Why? Every bank does its own risk analysis, as I say, of who they're going to do business with. Deutsche Bank decided to do business with Jeffrey Epstein when others didn't want to. And there are other examples of that. And in terms of human impact, we all know what that human impact was for young women and girls with respect to that matter. So additionally, the bonus and payment incentives. When I was a federal prosecutor, I was on the Enron task force. It was the 7th largest company, public company in the United States. It was inflated beyond all measure in its value. Its accounting and balance sheets were fake. And the banks enabled, some banks enabled this activity, as has been found and reported. When that company collapsed due to its securities fraud and money laundering across the board, supported by banks, many, many people were harmed. One of the reasons that Enron was problematic, in addition to the external enablers that has been mentioned, the lawyers, the accountants, and all of them that are supposed to be gatekeepers against fraud and illegal activity, was the review and the compensation structure of the individuals who worked there. And everybody, including the lawyers, were paid in part based on how they contributed to the earnings of the company. And that is wrong. And it tells you everything you need to know right there. And real people were hurt. The employees, pensioners, people who had invested their life savings. The problems were so endemic across Houston, which is what, the 6th largest city in the United States, or 7th, were endemic to the point where the Justice Department had to do a national team of prosecutors and not rely on the office there because there were so many conflicts of interest. So we've got to look at this across the board. We need trust in our financial institution and in our governments. Financial institutions have got to act as though they're supposed to prevent these problems and not just hand the problem off to law enforcement and deal with it after the fact. And they've got to think carefully about their risk analysis. And on the other side, we have to find ways to hold individuals accountable. The board has to have accountability, the C-suite has to have accountability, and other officers who went along or furthered it, it may not rise to the level of criminal activity prosecutable under our system, but there ought to be a consequence. Why do they keep their job? Why is there not no individual fine available? Others mentioned forfeiture and the like. When you have skin in that piece of the game, then you will not be so inclined to go along.
Thanks, Linda. This is a great moment to go to our next question, and I will continue with you because I think it's just connects very well. You were talking about some teams, like that team of prosecutors that had to work together, and And we're talking here about very complex financial operations. It's not that the money is just flowing in one country. It's just connected at a global scale. This systemic problem is a cross-border problem. And there are many challenges, like how do you know that those records are fake or not? How do you know who is behind a company? How do you know if it's corruption or it's not corruption? Where the money comes from? Who are the owners? So there are many questions that can come when you're talking about, well, investigating money flows and illicit financial flows. Could you talk us a bit more on one side? What are some of the main challenges that you have faced? How have you tackled them? And understand that you have fostered some collaborations too, and why collaborations can help investigate banks and illicit money flows.
Great. So for New York, for our regulator, the Department of Financial Services, we work very closely with our counterparts in federal government, with the SEC, with the Department of Justice, with OFAC, with our local district attorney's offices. And then also we pursue and we enter into memoranda of understanding with foreign regulators where we have institutions in common. And of course, to the extent that money laundering is, as you indicate, frequently a cross-border problem, you may have a conglomeration, which is a financial institution writ large, that has a home country in Europe, that is a primary regulator, that has a branch or an office in New York, and that is subject to the rules and the laws in New York and our oversight, but in addition to OFAC oversight, Department of Justice, and so on. So it's critically important for all of those components to be talking to each other, to be sharing information, to be working as one and collaborating. And that includes from the beginning to try to avoid problems, that includes during investigations, and it includes the results of the investigation and the fines and forfeitures across the board. It's also vitally important, and I've said this before, that the home country for a foreign bank, a bank that is foreign to the United States, is being vigilant and rigorous with that institution, because the branch or the office in the United States, frequently in New York, is sort of at the mercy of its own home office for how much resources it gets for compliance, what people are going to be paid, maybe even for approvals of business plans and risk matrix and all of that. So that what we frequently find is that the individual compliance personnel and their immediate managers are trying mightily to prevent inappropriate transactions from flowing through the bank. But if they don't have enough resources, then all they can do is swat at the problem. And if they're not getting the support from the home country, then they're not going to be effective. And if they're viewed as a cost center or back office, it's no good. So both American institutions and foreign institutions, and the foreign regulators need to support this, have to be reminded and supported and directed to approach this complex problem in the appropriate way. The investigations themselves, you're exactly right. They are extremely complex. To get evidence from overseas, and of course we have the mutual legal assistance treaties and others of the like, is extremely time consuming. It could take years to bring a complex financial matter involving cross-border transactions to some kind of a resolution. And what is happening in the meantime as years go by? And because they're more complex, it also means you can't do as many of them. So you're taking a high profile problem here and there, and it becomes a bit of a lottery in terms of who is going to be investigated and prosecuted and what is the result going to be. That's why I emphasize, as I said at the beginning, that proactivity and not just law enforcement is critically important. We have to get ahead of the problem. And we've got to look at it through a broader lens. And that's why dialogues like these are so important.
Thanks very much. And I would like to transfer that question to the journalism view. I remember from the FinCEN Files that so in some reports, like we had compliance officers sometimes leaving blank spaces intended for addresses tied to subjects that were flagged as suspicious. There were several data quality issues. Like, so the reports we were reviewing were like not in its best shape and form, but so like it's building many pieces of the puzzle. And in many cases, we had transactions that banks processed without knowing who was behind those transactions, some involving companies in secrecy jurisdictions. And there were many challenges. So Anthony, could you talk a bit more about what are some of the main challenges like journalists face during the FinCEN Files investigation that you think were central that we had to tackle? And also moving to the collaboration part, how collaborations like the FinCEN Files that was coordinated by ICJ, BuzzFeed News, and coordination with all media partners around the world have impacted the way in which we journalists investigate illicit money flows?
Right, I'll talk to the first one first. The challenges with the FinCEN Files were obviously enormous. We had data sanctity issues where we had to teach people how to handle these documents, quite frankly, in a way that was very secure. We had to essentially ramp up our understanding in a very fast way about, as Linda said, very complex financial matters. I am not a trained financial investigator, but I had to get to know it really quickly, right? And as she said, some of these transactions are enormously complicated. You just, because of the offshore nature of some of these entities and the money flows, it's all but impossible to understand who is on the front and the back end of the money. So you'd have to find, for instance, a source in the BVI who could go to a record set that is not public and tell you who, not the owner, not the beneficial owner of an entity is, but perhaps the lawyer who registered the company. I'm sure this is something that I know that ICJ has done, and I'm sure that Carina has done, I'm positive Linda as well. You know, they are inherently obscure. You know, this is meant to hide wealth. It is a system rigged in favor of the wealthy. And so we had to sort of crack the code. And beyond that, we had 3 million words to read, right? We had to create a system out of this messy morass that we could all use, we could all speak the same language. And I think this kind of cross-border investigation is impossible for any single news organization to tackle on its own. It just frankly is. We need folks who are on the ground in places like Angola and Hong Kong and Venezuela and elsewhere, right? And you need the resources that places like ICJ and BuzzFeed News are so blessed to have. We've got teams of investigators, got editors, we've got the stuff that we can put together to sort of share with our colleagues. I do frankly believe that in order for journalists to do more of these investigations, we should be looking for greater partnerships. I think that the days of a reporter protecting his or her scoop are dead. This, in order to do justice to the material and to do the most possible public good, we've got to ditch the idea that this is my scoop and I'm going to bring it home. And we've got to be able to share our resources, our documents, our expertise across the world. And I think that's just what BuzzFeed News found so enlightening and so warm about the partnership, is we were able to do this everywhere. And we're eager to do it again. I think that this is a problem that's not going away, and neither are we, frankly.
Thanks very much, Anthony. And yes, so collaborations are helping tackle some of these challenges. And we'd love to hear more from this civil society and Transparency International. What have been the challenges for civil society and for Transparency International while monitoring and exploring these topics? And how have collaborations worked for civil society in exposing the impact of illicit money flows, and what role has it played in holding governments, banks, and their leaders accountable?
Amelia, I think the most challenging thing, at least for us here in Portugal, I cannot speak on behalf of all of my colleagues at Transparency International. As you know, we have more than 100 chapters widespread over the world, but we collaborate a lot with our colleagues in Berlin. For example, the team working on beneficial ownership transparency and asset recovery and money laundering. But I think, at least for me, I think the main challenge is to become a true stakeholder. You see, we are the victims, or we, civil society organizations, we don't represent, but we gather and join people that are the victims of all of these schemes. But it seems that government officials and even investigative bodies, they don't look at us as part of the solution. They are always very scared when we try to learn more. And I think it happens the same with you, Anthony, and all your colleagues, is that why investigative journalists are looking at to these complex matters, what's their interest. And so I think the most challenging thing was that, to become a true stakeholder. And I think they now understand that we are stakeholders and that we have a say and we want to be heard. And at the same time, I think the other challenge was the narrative. And I need to thank Anthony and everyone, because there's now a new narrative related to money laundering. I think people, and I think, you know, the average citizen are now understanding why this is key, why it's important to tackle, and what's the impact in everyday lives. So I think that's the main challenging. The other challenge is to access to relevant information. That's why we advocate for beneficial ownership registries and open data, by the way, because it's free. I think Anthony saw it, because it's pretty much impossible to work, you know, huge amount of data if we don't have open data standards, like open ownership data standards or open corporate. I think that's pretty much impossible. And on another note, a personal note, I think it was also very challenging to work together with investigative journalists. I think from the last 2 years, at least for me, I had the chance, and I was lucky enough to be able to speak with investigative journalists from ICIJ or CCRP, even from BuzzFeed and other media, and able to share my expertise, but at the same time be briefed about their expertise. And I think this is a very good collaboration between civil society organizations working, for example, on anti-corruption and investigative media, like the ones we at TI have in the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, together with OCCRP, for example. And finally, and I think this is also very important, is North-South collaboration. Being a EU-based organization, we not always have the chance to engage with other civil society organizations in the global south. For example, you know, being able to work with people that are, you know, anti-corruption activists in Angola or in Mozambique or in Brazil or elsewhere. And that's key, and that's very important. And just to share, that's why we're now setting up an anti-corruption network from, you know, civil society organizations, activists, and academics, also willing to, you know, boost collaboration between Portuguese-speaking countries, because we have Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country, and if you see, all these schemes pass through Portugal. So you have these countries, and all the illicit financial flows get into Europe, and they are washed and clean to Portugal. So I think these are our main challenges, the ones that I can see at least, but I trust that we have many more than this one.
Thanks very much, Carina. I think we could continue talking for hours, but we're running out of time. Like, this is a very complex topic, and we're so lucky to have you all here. To close, I would love to hear more. Well, we have been talking about challenges, we have been talking about collaborations, we have been talking about the systemic failures. So what's next? What can be done? And I'd love to briefly, from your different perspective, like to close and tell us a bit more in terms of the journalism perspective. What has changed since the publication of the FinCEN Files? What impact has had the journalism itself? What can be done in terms of for Linda, what can be done at different levels to change the behavior of banks? What can be done in addition to imposing fines? Like what is next? What can we do? And for Carina then, what can be done to fix the broken system or a broken system from civil society? What are the possibilities? So like just, we should be brief as we're running out of time, but like kind of a short reflection on the impact and future next steps from each one of you. If we can start with you, Anthony, as I see you now already ready on the screen.
I think the most, the longest lasting impact of the FinCEN Files is the passing of the Corporate Transparency Act. I think that our reporting tipped it over the edge. I thought that lawmakers in what was one of the few bipartisan efforts of the past decade both agreed that we need to understand who the beneficial owners of American shell companies are. The law also gives greater protections to whistleblowers. There's quite a lot of value in that new bill, but I think that it doesn't go far enough. I think that as Carina said, it's important to have those beneficial owners to be public facing, right? And in the law, only the Treasury Department will have access to them. The public doesn't know. It's going to be more difficult for journalists and others to be able to understand who in fact registers and owns these entities. But I think that it's a really important first step. And it's suggested to me that there is real support in DC, which is so often broken. I thought this was one of the few places that both Republicans and Democrats said, you know what, this is a big deal, and we can take concrete, substantive steps to begin to work on illicit finance. And I think that, that's sort of our job. We're really grateful that the reporting led to a concrete step.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Now we can continue with Linda. What can be done at different levels, including top leadership, to change the behavior of banks?
Thank you. So your question at the beginning is, who is we? Who is responsible? Yes, we are all responsible, but that means we can all participate in the solutions. Government has to be more proactive and has to make anti-money laundering enforcement a priority and find ways for both the institutions and the boards and the individual officers who participated or approved accountable. Activists and journalists continue to speak out. As far as financial institutions are involved, I think at the root of this is too cramped of a view of what the financial institution is for. The financial institution, who does it serve? As long as large financial institutions believe that they only serve their shareholders, drive up the stock price, and benefit through their compensation accordingly, they will not take significant or at least effective steps to mitigate this problem. There is a movement, of course, for corporations to view themselves as more like a corporate citizen that, yes, has to serve shareholders, but also should be serving the community and should be thinking about the larger impact that they have, whether it's climate change, whether it's furthering criminal activity, whether it's diversity. We've all seen the protests across this country and in other countries calling for racial justice, economic justice, social justice, and even prior to this pandemic, the very active and effective movement to address the risks of climate change. Those who are running or seek to run major corporations, including financial institutions, I believe are starting to take notice and are starting to realize that they have to build that into the DNA of their own company and make it a part of what they look at every single day. Because business has to keep up with the people or it will be at a competitive disadvantage. So I think each of us in the mosaic has a role to play in painting a better picture in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much. Well, this has been great. I think, there's still a lot to be done, and we're very grateful to the three of you, Anthony Cormier, Carina Carvalho, and Linda Liswell. Thanks for all your time and all your great remarks and thoughts.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.